Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this week's episode. Many things I'm excited about, especially because he has a great name. On top of that, he is friends with my friends, so big shout out to Jeff Stern and Andy John there in Virginia, who both have been on the podcast. Obviously, Jeff is with EMI now. John has an incredible background. Not only was he with New York in emergency management as a commissioner over there, but he was also law enforcement, so he has a great background in understanding different perspectives and understanding the entire life cycle of emergency management. But now, as the Director of Safety and Security and Emergency Management for Virginia's Department of Transportation, he can bring lots of cool things. If you recall, maybe a year or two ago, I had Andy John on here, a good friend of mine, to talk about what happened in that winter storm. If you recall that big event that happened on the highway, well, John was there, and he spent 28 hours on the road trying to help that out. They've made a lot of changes, so there's lots of really cool things we can talk about. Let me bring him onto the show. John, thanks for joining me.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate it.
If you move your head just enough, it looks like you're wearing your old, there you go. The old cap. That's great. Hey, seriously. So we were talking a little bit before the podcast. I started asking lots of questions because I got really excited to hear from your perspective. But for the sake of my audience, can you just do a quick rundown of your background?
Sure. So I've been in public safety emergency management basically for the last 33 years now. I started with the NYPD. I was a police officer. I ended up working my way up to what they call Sergeant Special Assignment, which is basically like a unit commander with the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, which is basically, the NYPD SWAT, search and rescue. We basically did everything the fire department did, minus the fire. And then we did all the, search and rescue, barricaded perpetrators, things like that. I was also the hazmat team manager for the USAR team, the New York City, New York Task Force 1. I ran the NYPD's hazmat WMD program during anthrax. And I spent, over almost a year at Ground Zero after 9/11. I was the operations coordinator for NYPD Emergency Service at Ground Zero. Unfortunately, I got hurt in 2005, ended up retiring in 2006. Went on to work for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. You're probably not aware that we did a World Trade Center Phase 2 recovery effort where we found additional human remains. So I ran that operation for about a year. And then I went to work for the agency full time until I got my appointment for deputy commissioner at New York City Emergency Management. Basically did my 20 years in New York City and retired, came down to Virginia, was just doing some consulting, and then Hurricane Sandy hit, and the Bloomberg administration asked me to come back. So I supported fatality management for Sandy, but then I ran debris removal and the whole beach restoration project after Sandy until I started with VDOT. Came to VDOT in 2014. Worked here until 2017 when Jeff Stern hired me. I went to VDEM for about 18 months, got recruited back by VDOT, was back here for a couple of years. And then Mayor de Blasio, when Deanne Criswell went to FEMA, Mayor de Blasio appointed me as Emergency Management Commissioner in New York. Wasn't looking like I was getting reappointed when the new administration was coming in, and VDOT hadn't hired anybody yet. So for a third time, they gave me my job back. So I've been back here like 3 years last week, actually. So I've been with state of Virginia for just over 10 years now. And in between that, I do some consulting work. I run my own consulting company. I run a hazmat identification manufacturing company in California part-time. Do some consulting work for an IT company that actually does a lot of work with FEMA. So the only thing I've given up in my life is sleep. I kind of don't do that anymore.
The Elsie Harris perfectly designed for fine. This radio is radio Well, the people who say they don't sleep, they usually age poorly, but you look young and healthy and vibrant. So if you have a secret after the podcast, because I don't sleep and I look
No
like
problem.
trash, so we'll take that advice. For a guy who's done so many different things, especially in different worlds and different capacities, not on the public side, but also in the private side as well. I kind of float both of those worlds a little bit.
Yep.
A lot of the people that I interact with for emergency management, they talk about politics and emergency management, but they don't. How do I say that? They haven't reached that point in their career yet where they haven't actually met the politician themselves and
Yeah.
know how to work that realm. For somebody who has done it in multiple different states now, in multiple different capacities, what is your experience where with emergency management and politics? And I'll give you a pretty big hint. We had Pete on here, and he said that politics and really politicians, that whole process is built into emergency management. You'll never be able to separate it. What would you say to those emergency managers who want to get away from political appointees and get away from that process?
Find a different job. That would be number one, because you can't get a yeah, you can't get away from it. The first thing I would recommend to either younger or even senior people walking into these positions is you have to learn how to manage expectations immediately. You cannot you have to be confident enough in your position that you can say what you need to say. And if you're afraid to do that, you're never going to be successful because you become the scapegoat right away. So, I'll give you an example. And so in New York, when I was commissioner, we had Hurricane Ida. And Hurricane Ida came through, dropped 9.5 inches of rain in 3 hours, flooded a significant part of the city. We had 13 fatalities. Um, I was working, for Mayor de Blasio at the time, and I was trying to manage expectations, right? This is going to be bad. This isn't going to recover quickly. We may get a federal declaration or we won't. But then the challenge is it wasn't him. It was the federal congressmen and senators that wanted to be on the ground because it was an election year and they were making promises that they couldn't keep, right? They were making promises. And as you know, you work for FEMA, they were offering, and talking about funding very generically, and everybody was getting false expectations. So then my job was to come behind them and manage that expectation. So you have to manage it to the senior leadership that you're working for. You have to manage it to the public. And, you have to not give people false hope. And, the problem is, a big chunk of emergency management is about giving people money or housing or relief or something. Even the public safety agencies, right? There's massive grant programs that run through FEMA. It's making sure that people understand what the expectation is, right? And you have to manage it. I mean, even with Hurricane Helene that just came through, my job, here at VDOT is I work for our commissioner. I get to brief the governor on behalf of the agency. And, the questions come up, well, when are all the roads going to be closed? You have to underpromise and overdeliver, right? You have to come up with your best guess, add a percentage to that just because you need a safety net in case something goes wrong, another storm hits, something else can happen. So you have to manage the expectations there's no way to separate the politics out. It's impossible. All these senior level government positions, especially the political appointees, it's very challenging for them to navigate. And guys like me who sat in both chairs, I can speak my mind. And, I'd walk in the room and it's black and white. It is what it is. I'm going to say what I need to say. And you mentioned the winter storm. Fortunately or unfortunately, we had an outgoing governor that had the storm and an incoming governor that was inheriting the storm. And I could say, Governor Youngkin's team was great coming in. And again, Governor Northam's team was great. But Governor Youngkin's team came in and they weren't looking to really point fingers. They were really just asking, how do we get better? And we had to manage that expectation up front. Is this can happen again? That was the question. How do we avoid this? And my answer is you don't avoid it. You get better at making it go away after it happens. Mother Nature has a say and she usually wins.
The ability to retain dignity, even when you say you can't stop something, is an art that I'm still working on. I think a lot of other people are still working on. One of the one of the blessings, and that's a kind of a funny word to say for this, but one of the blessings of podcasting for the last 4 or 5 years is that I get to meet incredible people and then just shut up and, ask the question, provide my comments, but I really do wanna hear from other people. But when I was younger, I used to have this, like, thing where if I was in a meeting, I felt like I had to say something. And I would start to get like this like uncomfortable feeling like, oh, I haven't said something long enough. And it wasn't so much like I want to show that I'm important. It was because I felt like I had something to say, an opinion that I could share. And if I didn't get my opinion out there, somehow they were going to make a terrible choice. I was that narcissistic. But I feel like when we meet people in power, especially those who are our bosses or otherwise, we want to make sure that we they see our value, right? And we can help out. But I think it can backfire pretty heavily. One of the things I've been hitting on this whole year is how emergency managers always talk about how important communications is, but so many different areas of communications we struggle with. Again, going back to interacting with people who could fire you immediately and or if you don't get what you want, lose that art of negotiation, then the people you're trying to help don't get the help they need, whether it's the funding or otherwise to make those changes. How do you navigate being able to read the room?
I mean, that's experience, right? I mean, that's y- you have to learn the hard way, unfortunately. And if I hate the cliche, and I think you said this as well on one of the podcasts I listened to is, you can't be meeting these people for the first time at the disaster. Well, you better have a good understanding of what your bosses and what the political leadership needs to know or how they want that information delivered long before that disaster ever happened, right? So you're right. You need to read the room, but you also need to know the people that you're working with and working for. What are their goals? What motivates them? And are they that narcissistic person that wants to always be the guy with the answer or be out in front? Or do they allow you to, do they coach from behind and let you take the lead, right? You need to know who you're dealing with. Um, I worked for Calvin Drayton, who was a legend in EM from New York City. He was our first deputy for years, and he was a lead from behind guy the whole way. He would let you get out in front if you wanted to. If you didn't have the confidence to do it, he would step in and do it. But he would lead from behind all the time until he needed to jump in. And he would coach you. He would give you information to help you, read that room and help you learn. And, again, I got promoted to sergeant with the NYPD at 30 years old, 2 weeks before 9/11. I was thrust into this leadership position and I'm fifth generation NYPD. My father told me at a young age, he goes, man, you just don't mind calling the baby ugly. And I don't mind stepping up and saying things. And you're right. At a younger age, you do, and it's not even age, it's just experience, right? When you don't have the experience, you want to get your opinion out there no matter what. And I stuck my head in way too many places, coming up the rank. Um, but yeah, learning to read the room is, it just takes time. You need to know who you're dealing with. You need to do some research before you step in one of those rooms to see who's going to be in there. And over time, I I had the opportunity over the years to work for 3 mayors and 3 governors. Right, I worked for Giuliani, Bloomberg, and De Blasio in New York, and now I've worked for McAuliffe, Northam, and Youngkin here in Virginia. And they all have similar drive and um, similar goals. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle they're on, but they all consume information differently. So understanding how you need to present it, and it's interesting because Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Youngkin are very similar in their data analysts, right? They're financial guys. They're into numbers and understand numbers. So if you're going to go in the room and read the room. If you're going to go in there and brief some kind of data or numbers, be prepared to have the background information for that. Where, if you were, briefing some of these other people, Governor Northam was a doctor, right? He was a brilliant individual, but he wasn't into the numbers like these other leaders are. So you need to know who you're briefing and what your goals are, right? It's not even about reading the room. It's about, what do I need to get out of this room when I leave here? I'm coming in here to give them information, or am I coming in here to give them information to get a decision, right? That's two different things to do. Just briefing people is one thing, but briefing people to get them to make a decision, and hopefully you're convincing them enough to make a decision that you want, right? That it's not just any decision. You usually go in there with a goal. Not sure if that exactly answers your question, but that's kind of.
I actually think it perfectly answers the question. In fact, it reminded me of this incredible guy. He's one of the best emergency managers I've ever seen, and quite frankly, he has a better background than most. And I hired him to help us out with some contract work. And once or twice, I needed him to get on a sales call to help us out, to land a pretty important client. And he bombed. He was so bad at it. But when he would go after we would get the client, he was the best briefer I'd ever seen. He could get people to do what we needed them to do, and also for the right reasons, for the right cause, and the whole deal. And it was like putty. Like, people just went to him, and he could do whatever he wanted. But when he went to the other side of the house, man, he was terrible. And we would joke about it. I was like, dude, I can't bring you these calls anymore. And I do think there is a difference between be able to brief and be able to present and get people to like you, and then the other side of the house is to get them to do something for you. I think that's a fantastic point, and something that we really should practice. I was lucky enough to have a sales background before I got into emergency management. I was able to figure out, pretty quickly with the directors what their motivation was. Ultimately, everybody wants to be successful in their own jobs and in their own world, but how do they get there? Um, and quite frankly, be able to figure out how to do that, I think is a great point, to be able to do your research, figure out what motivates them, gets them there. But at the baseline, right, they want to be successful. Are you going to try to take something away from them to get what you want, or are you going to try to build them up in that process to be able to get to what you want? The latter, I think, works much more effective.
Yeah. To your point, you had a sales background before you came into this. I went to hostage and negotiation school, right? And part of that
So
part of
you
that
always
is
win. Yeah.
well, no, part of that is about trying to understand, in this really quick situation, how to read the room. Why is this person standing on the edge of a building getting ready to jump? And you learn to develop better skills and better communication skills. The whole NYPD was about learning how to communicate with people and talk to them in good situations, bad situations. I used to tell people all the time, nobody called 911 to invite us to a party. So everything you're walking into is a potential volatile situation, and you just have to learn how to communicate better. And it took me time. I'll go back to, and this is a little bit off topic, but it's gonna tie together here at the end when I talk about something else. But when I interviewed to be deputy commissioner in New York City Emergency Management, I went through this massive panel interview. Kelly McKinney, who was on the panel when I interviewed. Him and I have been good friends for many years. But after I got through the panel interview, I did a one-on-one interview with Joe Bruno. And I'm sure Joe Bruno was commissioner for many, many years in New York. I think he holds the record. I think it was 10 years. And he sat me down, and I was, I think 33, 34 years old. No, I was a little older than that. I was probably 38 years old. And he basically said, he goes, John, you're a a-hole, and everybody knows that, but you're the best guy for the job. So I need to teach you how to not be that guy, not run everybody over like an NYPD sergeant, and walk in the room and be more collegial. And, I took that to heart because, one, he insulted my ego, right? He called me an a-hole in front, in an interview. But he taught me a lot of great lessons about how to be more collegial and work with people, hear everybody out, to your point, right? You're a podcaster, so your job is to listen. He would teach me how to listen and then work to, convince people that, hey, we need to do this together. So, to your point, it's about communication, right? Talking to, Jeff Stern a couple of months ago, I guess EMI is working on a project to evaluate thousands and thousands of AARs. And the common thread in every one of them is communication. but they don't break that down, right? Was it radio communications? Was it cell phone communications? Was it this interpersonal communications? Was there written communication problems? Was there communications with the public? Communications is too broad, right? You need to narrow that down. And most of the time it's more misunderstanding than communication, right? I think that we need to categorize it just a little bit differently.
Yeah, there's gosh, you're gonna make me talk ad nauseum to the people who've been listening to years, but one of the biggest problems of emergency management is branding. No one knows what to expect. They don't know when which John is showing up, right? Like, they don't know if they're going to get somebody with years of experience who've been multiple agencies who've been able to do that, or they don't know if they're going to get a doomsday prepper who's going to tell them to build bunkers and 72-hour kits. And quite frankly, a lot of people on the other side of that don't want to hear that. They don't want to deal with that. And they're hiring you to take care of that problem, but they also need you to be logical. And because we don't have great branding as an industry as wide, again, people don't know what they're going to get. Now, the readiness lab, we've been trying to attack that. Whether people like it or not, we've been putting out, hey, here are the standards for emergency management, at least in terms of that branding. Here are the foundations of what people should have. And it's been cool. Like, we got a picture the other day from, I think, somebody in Oregon wearing one of our next level emergency management icon hats. And that was a big deal to me. I was just like, all right, like, people are wanting to say, hey, this is who I am. And I think that helps out a lot, especially if they're walking in there. Now, again, the political side of that is because they're interacting with high level people with typically a ton of experience. They do know what they're going to get, and they have high expectations of what they're going to get in that, right? They want to look successful in either stopping the disaster, or if a disaster hits, they can show up on scene and say, we got this. Our state got this. The federals got this, and they don't want to look bad. And so there's that ability to manage those expectations. I want to switch it here a little bit because of your law enforcement background. I see a ton of military and military police, funny enough, but military and firefighters, paramedics, even dispatchers, they see a second career in emergency management. Or if they don't want to do that tactician stuff anymore, they want to move over to the other stuff. I do find that law enforcement, when they move over, well, everybody has their own challenges that they have to address. But man, that command and control is so strong for a good reason in law enforcement. It seems particularly difficult to move over to coordinate, collaborate. If you're going to talk to people who are moving from law enforcement to emergency management, how do you balance the two worlds where you bring in all the strengths that law enforcement can bring over, but start to be able to pull back without losing any of the passion? Because that's the other problem with that. Well, how would you address that?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you go through the police academy and the things you learn in law enforcement, and I coming out of NYPD, we always worked with partners, right? So we always had two of us to balance out the threat, the risk, and the communication, right? One guy was always better at something, somebody might have spoke a second language. You always had each other to lean on. Now I spend a lot of time with the Virginia State Police and talking to them about how they train people. And from day one in the academy, because these guys work alone, which is what most law enforcement does around the country, is they teach them to take control, right? You need to take control of the situation because your life might be at stake, right? So I don't want to say you have to deprogram yourself when you retire. I could tell you, I've been retired a long time and I still walk around with my head on a swivel when I'm out in public or with my family. It's just ingrained in you, from seeing bad things your whole life. But you really just have to, it's not deprogramming, it's retraining your brain to understand that I don't need to take over immediately and lead this, right? If that's my role, then that's my role and I know how to do it. But we need to take a step back and say, okay, who is responsible for what part of this event or incident, right? And, I am not a big ICS guy. I actually think it gets in the way sometimes, but I am about who has jurisdictional authority and who has the responsibility to make this happen. Normally, it's not EM, right? Especially in the initial phases of the incident. The emergency managers are there to make sure Everybody who needs to be there is on scene, and who needs to own each part of the problem. Now, as we life cycle into recovery, usually EM owns most of it because there's nobody else to do it. But in the initial phases of an incident, again, your point about branding and identity, and what we were talking about before we started this was, if I tell people I work for NYPD, they know what the follow-up questions are. Were you a detective? Did you work on the SWAT team? Did you do this? If you tell people you work in emergency management, they don't know the follow-up question. They don't know what's next, right? Oh, do you do planning? Are you a grant manager? Are you in logistics? So, if you're a law enforcement officer transitioning, you have to retrain yourself to understand, okay, I'm going to use my public safety experience and my leadership abilities, but I need to apply them a little bit differently so that I can, be more collaborative. And like I was saying about what Joe Bruno said to me earlier is, your job is to just make it go away, right? You need to fix this problem, and you're not really worried about future relationships at that point, because sometimes it's life or death. And in a role, depending on the role you're in EM, you need to just understand who has the jurisdictional responsibility, who is going to help you make this problem go away, coordinate amongst multiple different disciplines, and you're not in charge, right? You don't even have the resources most of the time as an emergency manager to make any of these problems go away. I mean, I think, again, and this is something, I know we don't have hours to talk, but I could talk for hours about this, is the reason why I work for VDOT is we're an operational organization, and being an emergency manager in an operational organization is so much different than working at state emergency management or even New York City emergency management, where I have 10,000 people that work in my agency and I can make problems go away. When I was in NYPD, we had 40,000 people. We can make problems go away. When I was at New York City emergency management, even as the commissioner, I had to call the police commissioner or the fire commissioner or the parks commissioner to get anything done. And my brain was trained by NYPD to just say, let's make this go away. Now my brain is trained to say, who can make this go away, and how do I coordinate and collaborate with them to do that, to make us all successful?
Okay, just like that one segment right there, can we turn that into like a 15-part episode? Because like you just explained the problem perfectly. And I really do hope whoever's listening just does a quick rewind and listen to everything you just said and try to implement. Like the reality is like, gosh, I have like 15 follow-up questions to everything you just said. I'm serious. I'm going to have to have you come back 10 times, but
That's fine.
the
You can
like
give me my own podcast. That's fine.
you know what? Done. Deal. Honestly, if you want, I would do that immediately. Take over Disaster Tough. I'm out of here. But and honestly, the John legacy can live on. But um, the first part of that, because I'm going to have 2 or 3 follow-up questions for you, and I'm going to not try to get off the rails because I'm pretty excited about this part. When you're talking about emergency management as a whole, I agree. Nobody knows what they're getting, and you. The very first question is when I tell people I work in emergency management, they say, "What's that?" The other thing is like, it'd be weird to go up to somebody and say, "Hey, what do you do?" And they're like, "I work in the medical field." Cool, but what do you do in the medical field, right? Are you a pharmacist? Are you an ER doctor? Are you, the front
Radiological
desk?
technician, yeah.
Yeah, they have no idea. So when you say you're working emergency management, nobody knows what they're going to get. The other part of that is when you say NYPD, immediately in my mind, I see a logo, I have a persona, I know what I'm going to get. Like I think of 9/11, I think of, lights and sirens. I have a persona that I'm thinking of, and I think I know what I'm going to get when I think NYPD. Same thing with most other emergency services. Again, going back to emergency management, I don't know what I'm going to get. One of the trainings that we do, and you should come. Jeff has come. Doug Baton, I think, is coming in January, so you should come too. But we're addressing that head on through this dynamic populations classes. We bring in, well, we call it an emergency management course, but I basically have all non-emergency managers teaching emergency managers what they should do. I'm really tired of emergency managers assuming what the other side wants. I want to hear from law enforcement, from fire, from military, from corporate security, from all these different perspectives. It's saying, hey, if you are going to help me out from a strategic level, this is the best way to do it. Evacuations, mass care, CBRN, whatever that perspective is, you would be a phenomenal speaker at that, to be able to help that. So that's the first part. The second part of that, here's the question: is if we're in the lane of thinking, I know what I'm going to get when I get X, right? Law enforcement, specifically NYPD or firefighter, whatever it may be. If emergency managers could learn from law enforcement, what do you think law enforcement? Well, what are the pros of law enforcement that emergency managers should start learning from so they can create a persona?
I mean,
Flipping the
that's
coin there.
yeah, I mean, that's a difficult, without spending some time thinking about it, but I'm, never shy about giving my opinion, so I may as well throw something out there. I would say discipline is number one, right? Is understanding the chain of command. You know, EM, we have kind of a pseudo chain of command with ICS, but the challenge with ICS is you have your everyday structure to work, and then we have a disaster and we think everybody's just going to switch into this ICS structure and it's going to work seamlessly. Um, eh, I think so. My perspective with law enforcement is probably different than a lot of people's because of the type of organization that NYPD was, right? So NYPD, we had a patrol guide, right? That was like the guiding principles of the whole agency. And even though it was a guide, it was very, very prescriptive, right? I mean, down to what each individual was supposed to do and what entries you were going to make in your memo book. It was very, very mature, disciplined, and thought out. I think EM as a profession, we don't have that kind of history just yet, right? If I asked you, what is the most significant emergency management movie that's out there? I mean, who's going to know? Who's going to give you a good answer to that? Maybe Tommy Lee
Batman
Jones.
Begins.
Maybe Tommy Lee Jones in Volcano, right, or whatever that
That's
one
an
was.
awesome movie, by the way.
Yeah, that's people's perspective of it. So, um, just kind of trying to build an identity is hard. Like people know what law enforcement does, and I think, trying to get out there and market better to people and have people more understand what you do. Like, New York City did a really good job of putting people out in the field, and we would do these community events, and people would understand, we're out there trying to do preparedness and readiness and have a go bag and sign up for Notify NYC and do these things. Law enforcement don't need to do any of that, right?
Yeah.
You call 911, you pretty much know what you're going to get. So I guess, my short answer to a long answer that I'm drawing on here about would be, understanding your policies and procedures and having them developed out of what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, understanding the chain of command and the discipline within that, and really a formalized training program, right? And again, not to turn this into the "We All Love Jeff Stern" podcast, because we do, but that's what he's trying to do with EMI, right?
Yeah.
And I went through the Vanguard program that he's running, and it was an amazing program because, to your point, the people that we got to interact with from the multiple different disciplines that really feed into emergency management, I got a lot out of the briefings that were done by the NGOs, the philanthropy group, and some of the utilities that were in there. Like just hearing their process in the back end, to what you were saying earlier, and understanding what they do from them, right? I'm skipping to your neck, skipping ahead here, but Jeff has done a really good job of trying to have more of an academy training program for people to start. And I know there are multiple different routes to EM, right? You were in public safety or the military or somewhere else, and you transitioned into a new career. You went to a university program and got either your bachelor's or your master's, and you came in. You worked volunteer work, and then you started at the entry level at an EM agency. So there's multiple different entry points, which I think is good because you get a lot of unique experiences and unique levels of capability. But there's no set standard, to your point earlier, of what that is. And law enforcement has that standard, right? Law enforcement pretty much, you know, uh, has, the DOJ sets certain standards. Some agencies
Mm.
follow it, some don't. But, the fact is that every law enforcement agency has an academy. They'll push people through it before they can go out in the field. And, I mean, I know that's a very general statement, and maybe some
Actually,
communities don't do that, but it's a standardization.
hey, we just want to do a quick pause X to thank all of our sponsors with the Readiness Lab Podcast Network, L3 Harris, Forerunner, C. Bernie World, HQE Systems, Ampapar Response Training Center, Impulse, Doberman Emergency Management, and especially all of you who subscribe to the TRL Insider Program and who are listening to this episode right now. Thank you so much for your support. Let's jump back in. You said the three magic words. I was really hoping you'd say them: discipline, academy, standardization. Again, it's not about excluding people, it's about helping the other side understand our value and therefore being more valuable in that role. And honestly, whether it's high level or not, I think we would have to write a book if we really wanted to get into the details and the minutia of how to do that. But yeah, again, without trying to be the fanboy of Jeff Stern, what he's doing over there with creating the university, with EMI, with everything that he's trying to push forward, he is a change agent. And anytime you have a change agent, there's going to be some people who push back, and there's people who are not. Luckily for our field, Jeff is up to the task. And as a change agent, if we actually back him up, we will be more successful in our jobs. And that's what we want. And so, anytime that I hear any pushback on, oh, why are we creating the university? It's because people don't understand that they're not very impactful in their job. I just don't believe that they are. And I believe that Jeff will help make them better ultimately. From kind of a lighthearted perspective, we had another podcast. This is the podcast you should be on. It was called Movie After Action Review, Movie R, and it was a fun project. And we looked at different scenes in different movies and talked about how unrealistic they were. We looked at Volcano, we looked at Twister, we looked at Batman Begins, we looked at a couple different other movies. Santa Claus, like in Santa Claus, he kills the guy, hides the body, starts wearing his clothes and assumes his persona. That's pretty messed up, and it's like a kids movie, right? So anyway, so we just try to have some fun with it. But there's the pop culture is where people derive their information from. I think we also looked at Lord of the Rings. But the very last thing I want to ask you about, in fact, we're over time here, but I do appreciate your time, is about ICS. ICS, I thought, was great for large organizations pre-disaster. And honestly, it has its place in disaster, but what would drive me most crazy was that, again, people don't know what they're going to expect when they get something. We have a planning section that mostly does documentation, and we have an operations section that mostly does planning in large disasters. And I would meet people who in operations, they would call themselves operators, which is even more ridiculous, right? And so if you are like me, and it sounds like you are, where you see ICS has its place, but ICS doesn't always have its place, how do you combat the problem of we should create standards but be flexible in those standards? Are we like pirates? Are we more about guidelines? Where are we at?
So I think you just hit the word guidelines, right? So to me, like I said, NYPD's patrol guide wasn't a guide, right? That was a step-by-step operational manual. Guidelines and not plan is what I've been transforming a lot of the things here at VDOT to, especially after the January 2022 storm, is on the, emergency response and the emergency recovery side. We need a guide to kind of give us direction. But because every scenario is different, you can't put it in a box or in a silo every time, because you have to understand that there needs to be some level of flexibility. So, to your point, I think ICS, developed by the Forest Service for forest fire, probably works amazing for them because they built it for them to do it. Now, post 9/11, everybody was grasping at straws because they didn't think we knew how to coordinate anything, and they shoved ICS out there to do all hazards. And I think it was not matured enough or thought about enough to transform it from what it was built for to what we're trying to implement now. I just think there is a place for ICS. It's not in the EOC, right? That's one part that people don't understand is incident command is to run the actual incident on the ground in the field, not to run a statewide complex incident from your EOC, right? Now, people argue COVID was a little bit different and how did we navigate that? But I'm not, so I'll give you a really quick example. When I worked for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, we had a contractor come in after 9/11 to help us, build some emergency response planning and build the city's mass fatality plan and the family assistance center plan. And this is a whole nother topic we could spend 10 episodes on because fatality management in itself is complex and nobody understands it. But our contractor, she did a really great job with the plan, but her mandate was really tough because she tried to build an org chart, ICS org chart, on top of the agency's org chart, right? So every day this agency runs and, they're responding and removing bodies from homes and doing investigations in the field and doing autopsies and, doing the lab work and DNA work. And now we have a disaster and we're going to take all those people and shuffle them up and put them in this new structure under planning, logistics, operations, and we had this org chart that printed on a plotter covered my whole office, all the walls. And I just went up with a red pen and I was just looking at it. And I drew a box at the bottom and I wrote blood mopper. And she looked at me like I was insane. And she's like, what is that? I said, well, he's the only person that you didn't put is the guy that cleans the morgue after we do an autopsy. So we might as well put him on there too. And it just brought a realization to how unnecessary this was for the actual agency operation to transform into an ICS structure during an emergency. We don't need that. The agency runs, you leave it alone. Now, when OCME had to go interact with FDNY and NYPD and New York City Emergency Management and everybody else, there was probably a place in an org chart somewhere that they needed to fit in under intel investigations underneath, operations somewhere. But it's just overwhelming at times, So again, back to your original questions. Guidelines have to be flexible. I think if you are in a place that supports and uses ICS and it's worked for you, congratulations. I think that's amazing. I personally haven't experienced that in my career. And I've, deployed to disasters in a lot of places. I think you just need strong leadership who understand the mission, who understand the resources they have, who understand kind of the jurisdictional authorities and the legal, what you can legally do to support this and make this problem go away. And everybody has their role. As long as they're coordinating within their roles, this can all work fine. I'll just segue to this, right? If you have a large scale hurricane in any jurisdiction, inland, coastal, when does response start, right? When does response start? It starts usually when conditions are clear enough where you could put people out in the field and they don't get hurt, right? Well, I agree with that. But if you have every road blocked by trees or power lines or floods, none of your public safety people are really going anywhere yet, right? So it's your Department of Transportation or your public works who need to clear those roads and make them safe to initiate that response, right? You could put a bunch of, cops and firemen out there with chainsaws and let them try and clear that road, but they don't have that equipment, right? So do I need to be in an ICS structure to understand what my role is in an emergency as the lead emergency manager for a transportation agency? No, I need to say, okay, it's safe for my people to get out there. I'm going to put them out there in the field. We're going to coordinate with the local responders to understand where are the priorities for them to clear first, hospitals, firehouses, police stations, whatever they deem necessary. But that's it, right? Once I understand where I got to go, I don't need an incident commander who has no idea how I do my job to tell me what to do. He just needs to tell me where to go to support the rest of this operation. So there's just this misconception of, the incident commander is the end all be all. He's going to know everything and know how to do everything. he could set priorities, but he needs to let the people that understand the discipline go do their job, right? Um, I'll just give you one more example of that in my experience. We did uh, a active shooter WMD event at one of our local amusement parks, and it was really a federal exercise where the FBI brought in their HRT and some of their hazmat groups. And I was at VDEM at the time, and massive full scale exercise. It was actually awesome. They flew in Black Hawks. It was the coolest thing you'd ever see. And they did a briefing, and the leader from the FBI got up on a platform, and he's like, "Okay, I'm the incident commander, and these are the priorities." And he had this set briefing, and me being the a hole that Joe Bruno thought I was, I raised my hand and I said, um, "What's the designated hospital where we're going to be bringing the victims from this event?" And he looked at his guys. I said, "And what's the route that you want us to use for those ambulances? And I started to hammer him with all the minutia that are super important, right? And he's like, "Well, we're not dealing with any of that." And I'm like, "Well, you're in charge. You're the incident commander. You need to either delegate that and say who's going to do this. But if you're going to stand there and tell us you're in charge of nothing but this investigation and what your teams are doing. Why don't you just let the rest of us handle the rest of this situation?" Like, and that whole unified command is a more palatable discipline to me, or not even discipline, but just a idea, because you leave people who understand their roles, running their roles, and all they're doing is coordinating at a command post so that we're not stepping on each other.
I have two big examples of everything you're saying, and to really back you up in my own experiences as well. The first one was at FEMA Region 9. There was a small group who wanted to put evacuation routes together. And I think I had been working there for about a month and a half. I just moved over to FEMA, brand new guy. Nobody knew who I was. And they showed the evacuation route out of Oakland, and the only route that again, a small group, only route that they came up with was by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. And I said, "Hey, did you coordinate with Lawrence Livermore or anybody else with that route?" "No, we don't need to. This is, about getting people out." So I said, "Well, LNL has live WMD stuff there, and if there's a massive earthquake, you really want to put a plume over the only evacuation route?" "Oh, they haven't had that stuff in years." And I said, "Well, I was there 4 months ago, and yes, they do." And it was the most awkward, like, silent moment in the room. I said, like, your greatest strength here is that you're in and by major areas like Oakland, San Francisco, LNL, other people, Berkeley. Like, you could easily coordinate with them and say, "Hey, is this a good idea or a bad idea?" And that unified command, getting more intel to be able to make good decisions, to be able to not think about that is a big problem. The second example I have is a more recent one. That was maybe 10 years ago. This one was this year. I have a client that is a stadium, and I had a staff member who tried to rearrange their entire C-suite to match with ICS, and I saw the plan, and immediately ripped it up. I said, This cannot happen. You're not going to have a VP of communications or a CEO all of a sudden not be the VP of communications and the CEO. They're going to get up and say, 'I'm the VP of communications,' or 'I'm the CEO.' And they need to be able to just to be them. And also, you're going to confuse them." The other idea was to get the CEO of a stadium to take ICS training. They're not going to sit there and do 30 minutes of ICS 700. That's not their job. They're hiring other people to do the job. Now, to everybody's credit, the director of security needs to be able to operate within city ordinances, and there is an ordinance that requires the director of security become the incident commander. So, okay, you name that person the incident commander, but otherwise keep people in their job and be less confusing. And
Yeah.
so, guidelines versus organization, everything you're saying, I keep nodding my head. If you're not watching this podcast, if you're listening, like most people, John, you're absolutely incredible. Obviously, your experience is off the charts. I do want you to come back. If you do want your own podcast, you got it immediately. I
Cool.
think you have a lot to say, and you're a change agent in your own right. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on. Thank you again for talking with me.
No problem. And I do know, you ended some of your other podcasts, and if you're over time, you can cut this out. But one of the questions you like to ask people is, what would you offer to younger emergency managers coming into this field? And this is something I've spoken about many times, is the first thing they need to do is get a mentor. All the education, all the training, all the experience is great, but you need a mentor. You need somebody behind you that you can bounce questions off. And it really doesn't matter what level you're at in this business. Even when I was commissioner in New York City, I had 2 or 3 people that I would lean on, and they were not at that senior level, but they were just smart, measured, and brilliant people in their own disciplines. But they always gave me good advice, right? So if you're a young person coming into this field, and I try to do this now with a lot of the younger people and that I interact with, and it's funny, when I became commissioner, you don't realize how you've impacted people on your way up. And a lot of people reached out to me and talked to me about how I mentored them or how I gave them some piece of advice. And when you have mentors, you can offer and be a mentor a lot easier, right? Because you know what questions to ask your mentors. And then when younger, even if you're not directly mentoring people, but if they just ask you questions, you give them better advice just because you've been through that process. So mentoring, coaching, decide what terminology you want to use. But for the younger people, or people in entering this career, or working their way up through this career, if you don't have a good mentor, and you don't need one, right? You could have one, and that's great, but having a network of people that you can lean on and ask questions to and give you good advice is paramount through any career, but especially this one, because to your point, sometimes it's undefined, sometimes it's super challenging, super stressful. The poor folks at FEMA are going through hell right now with these negative press that they're handling, and some of the just the amount of disasters and deployments that their folks are dealing with. It's mentally stressful, right? So having someone to talk to and having a good network of mentors is key. So I know we're done. I just wanted to offer that up at the end.
I'm not going to cut out anything you're going to say. I'll cut out things I might say, but to your credit on the mentor thing, I never really sought out mentors, but I was very lucky to have a former boss who was an incredible mentor to me. He's also a guy who led behind the scenes. He never spoke up first. He kind of let you fall on your face. He would never make you look bad or embarrass you, but he would allow you to have the opportunity. But then he would quietly, just behind the scenes, help you. And I really appreciated that. The second one was a couple years ago when I went into the private sector. Let's be real, consultants have a terrible rep, and probably for a good reason. There's some really great companies out there. I hope that we are one of them, but there's also trash out there. And so I invited this keynote speaker to come to one of our events, and he sat me down on, I think, day 2 and said, "Hey, can I just take an hour with you?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he started giving me a ton of advice. And everything he said, I basically enshrined. And you fast forward 3 or 4 years, and like, I go to him all the time now. I am so lucky that he chose a guy half his age, who's trying to do some cool things in the field, but was making a lot of mistakes, to sit down quietly and to say, "Let me help you out."
Yeah.
And all of his advice was sound, and I took it, and I keep trying to take it. I'm grateful for the people who choose to be a mentor as well. And so, again, be teachable so that you can get a mentor. And if you've been down the road and you can help people avoid the mistakes, choose to be a mentor. And I think
100%.
that's, again, great way to end the podcast. Okay, so I have to put on the other hat for a second. Everybody, if you got something out of this episode, you got to give us that like and subscribe. It is the fastest way we know that you liked it. If you have something for John, or you've had an experience with him, it sounds like, between Andy, John, and Doug Bayton and a lot of other people, we have a lot of same friends, but we also have a lot of people who've interacted with him. If you've gotten something from this episode, we'd love to see it in the comments on our social media posts. If you have a question specifically for him that you don't want to share publicly, you can send us an email at contact@thereadinesslab.com. We'll forward on to him. And with that, we'll see you for the next one. Peace.